I think a big underlying issue of risk is an issue of ethics and citizenship. Who is to actually be able to decide what level of risk is acceptable for a person to choose to take? And that is a very important question, and particularly where medicines, for example, that are developed for one condition prove effective in another. And some of these medicines, which are developed for therapeutically, have other uses, for example, to improve concentration for some drugs, or to improve memory, or even to improve cognitive performance in exams. I think there's an important question: is who is to be the gatekeeper of this risk? Is it to be the medical profession? Is it to be the government through regulation? Or is it to be the citizen through their own informed choices about the risks that they find acceptable to take? I think the best way to avoid totalitarianism is to increase the domain of individual choice, always to trust the citizen to make choices for themselves. Now, of course, this has its dangers, but the alternative, of course, is a state where people do not make choices for themselves. These choices are managed very often by the medical profession, but also by regulatory bodies like the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority and other regulatory bodies as well.
If you've got an extraordinarily expensive drug, which is of unlimited availability, somebody has to decide, and it is not a sensible way to decide as they do in the United States. That the people who can afford to buy this drug will have it, even if they need it less than somebody who can't afford to buy it. So much though you might dislike state regulation, I think that genetics is, in the end, has to be regulated by the law, which means the state.
Of course, ultimately, the state takes responsibility for deciding the level of state interference in these decisions. But of course, it is the citizen's responsibility to determine through the democratic process how the state exercises that responsibility.
But there's a huge onus, I think, on scientists who are working in these areas to communicate results in a palatable, acceptable, understandable fashion. I think one of the disappointments to me of the era of genome screening is that the hype that went with the first results, suggesting actually that we would move to an era of population-based screening for every disease that you could possibly imagine. I think anybody who works in the field doesn't see that that's the direction that we're going in. We can see very practical and realistic opportunities of the sort that Di's described, so that we can better tailor treatment to the right patients. Maybe we will assess risk in a collection of individuals who are already known to be at higher risk, where adding in genetic information may again further inform decisions.
In all of these areas, the decision that people come to is a very personal one, and what's right for one family isn't necessarily right for another person. The whole business of predictive genetic testing, if you've got a family history of something like Huntington's disease, some people will decide that they want to know, do they carry the gene that's changed in that condition? But other people, many other people, will decide that while there is no effective therapy for this condition, they would rather not know about it.
And John Harris, I just want to ask, surely it's sometimes the most vulnerable individuals who are at risk, and yet you're asking them to make certain kinds of decisions. How do you marry that with the idea of
vulnerability is a very ambiguous term. Individuals can be vulnerable for a whole range of reasons. They can be vulnerable because they're poor, but it doesn't mean that they're incapable of making decisions. So we have to be very, I think, careful about how we use a category like vulnerable individuals, because there are millions of ways of being vulnerable, but very few of them actually affect decision making.
I would prefer that anybody who's having a test which might be predictive of their future health or for risk for their children, that they knew what the test was about and what the results might yield. I mean, obviously, we strive to be non-directive in our counselling, but on the other hand, I think, I don't know whether that's an achievable goal, and there are different ways of giving people information.
Would you agree that actually part of the attraction of the internet for many people is that it's a way of bypassing the sort of personal contact that actually they don't want to have with professionals?
Yeah. What I fear is that if these so-called predictive tests, which aren't actually that predictive, are extremely widely available, and people get their printouts back and bits of information there, should my clinic be full of people who have entered into that knowingly and have got information that they don't know how predictive it is, and I don't know how predictive it is? Should my clinics be full of those people, or should it be full of people who have got a very significant risk of a genetic disorder, whether we can actually offer a more appropriate service for somebody who's much higher at risk?